Thank you very much for the introduction and invitation. Topic for today is Foresight as consolation, with a perspective on the potential relevance of Kant and his pragmatic anthropology for these topics. And Foresight as consolation, maybe in a kind of Montreal variation, could be looking at the cracks in history to let some consolation in. Right, so it's a specific way of looking at history and the future. Where I would like to propose to you that on the one hand, Kant early on had interesting philosophical, in German, it's a Denkungsart, a mindset for thinking about these issues, which I would like to propose to you. And secondly, based on that, this philosophical version invites some reflections that could be interesting for the present when we talk about all these important sustainability issues, which today, of course, are often more dystopian than utopian. And so this topic of consolation, I believe, is particularly important and pertinent again. And my idea for this reason is to start briefly in the present, dystopia, future making, and strategic foresight, just to provide a bit of background, how I got to this topic. Then speak about Kant's philosophical version of foresight as consolation, and then move back to some ideas of what might be the relevance of these ideas from the past for the future. So I'm teaching in sustainability courses, and I think as many people, I'm often using something like what you see here on the screen. This is the famous Planetary Boundaries framework from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, which basically says if we assess or if we take a long-term perspective, last 10,000 years, the Holocene, see it as a kind of safe operating space, the green area that you see in the middle. We can, on the one hand, identify relatively favorable conditions for the emergence of cultures, cities, and so forth across the globe. But we can also see that over the last 3 centuries or so, there was a significant change to this Holocene, which is why we speak about the Anthropocene now, where these boundaries of this safe operating space have been pushed. Notably because the advent of global capitalism was powered by fossil fuel use. So fossil fuel creates all these CO2 emissions. And so on top of this famous planetary boundaries, we see the CO2 concentration, which are, according to this assessment, way beyond what is a safe threshold. So we are in an area of risk. Where we just know there is considerable uncertainty and risks. But what exactly will be a new potential equilibrium in a 1.5 or 3 degree warming hothouse Earth is unknown. As it is unknown that fossil fuels are not only producing emissions, they are also used for producing all kinds of plastics. So we have here on the right side the novel entities, all kinds of new entities that are entering the environment. And again, according to this assessment, we are beyond thresholds, and we only know that they're entering animals, our food chains, are changing reproduction with a very high level of risk. That is, however, really in an area of uncertainty. And you can continue across these boundaries. Biodiversity, we're in a phase of mass extinction. Following the last one was the dinosaurs. Now it's us. This is very strongly linked to land system change. So expansion of cities, construction of roads, changing to coastal lines, which have a very big impact on ecosystems. As does the damming or canalization of rivers, mineralization of soils, which push the freshwater boundary. And all this is, of course, also linked to our agricultural green revolution, which in order to produce more productivity, needs a lot of phosphate and nitrate to produce this enormous increase in economic productivity across all kinds of sectors, which, however, at the same time, as you can see here, 9 boundaries assessed, so they do this regularly, and by now they say 7 of these boundaries have been crossed, really yields in total a pretty dystopian picture of what is happening and what is to come. And precisely for that reason, I think, there has also been increasing interest in the social sciences and sustainability research to say, okay, what can we do about this? How can we respond to that? And one domain of response is this so-called what Serafine already introduced, future making and strategic foresight. And I just want to illustrate it first via a story. When I started working here in Montreal 5 years ago, and in the beginning I met Albert Mondor, a horticulturalist who works in urban gardening. And at the time, there was, you see here on the left side, you see a well-known highway of Montreal, which was built in the 50s when Montreal, after the war, there was the modernization period. So the idea was, how can the city grow and enable people to travel fast from the growing suburbs into the jobs in the center. So there was this huge construction of a highway, which no doubt served its purpose of this transportation goal of allowing people to move faster long distances, so you could live 10, 20, 30 kilometers from your workplace. But it also, of course, produced what in Montreal is known as a big scar, a kind of separation of neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods were entirely destroyed, noise pollution, air pollution, and so forth. And so when I met him, the Ministry of Transportation had just announced that there was time to remake this infrastructure, and their plan was to just do the same thing again. And Albert at that point said, okay, could we not do something else instead of just remaking this infrastructure? Could we not think, what is the purpose of such transportation and other functions in a city? And as you can see on the right side, he, with many colleagues, came up with this idea that we could say, yes, transportation is of course absolutely central, but maybe we could nudge it more in a direction of public mobility, and thereby also gain more space for people to cross safely between their neighborhoods, have more green space for restoration, have more space maybe even for urban agriculture. So all kinds of options came about via this idea of saying, instead of just continuing what we do, envisaging something alternative that might inspire people to think, okay, what are urban options for Montreal 50, 30 years from now? These are long-term projects, and transportation ministries have very long planning cycles. And with such visions, of course, comes then the idea, what would we have to do now to make such desirable futures more probable? And this is exactly where this backcasting comes in that Serafine already mentioned. So this idea is that if we can identify certain desirable futures, what are transition pathways to make such desirable futures more probable? And this is by no means something that is just linked to urbanism and such projects. And another little crack, just to illustrate the same point. There is a lot of concern in sustainability about the way we organize our economy as a linear economy, meaning resource extraction, production, consumption, distribution, consumption, and then a lot of this ends up as waste. And in Quebec, the estimate is that under 5% of the goods are in the end recycled or reused, meaning the large majority of what is produced ends up as waste and is not reused or recycled, upcycled, transformed in the economy. So it's really a very linear economy. And Quebec or Canada are by no means the only ones who have this systemic feature. And so what you see here in this complex graph is an effort of the Quebec Research Network on Circular Economy, which basically said, if we know there is this systemic development, could we not, in a stakeholder process, think of what are desirable futures for Quebec? And since it's a very systemic concern, they said, okay, let's really project into the future. On the right side, you see 2050. So different scenarios were written to identify desirable options and undesirable dystopian aspects too. And based on that, a vision was co-produced of, you see here on the right side, circular production, more sober consumption, ideas about inclusive and transparent governance that provided a vision to then, in a 2-year stakeholder process, ask, if we have this kind of vision, what would be milestones that would be needed to make such a vision more probable on the different levels of Quebec, municipal, but also regional and provincial. And yes, as you can see here, or at least for me, this is really a kind of beautiful illustration of complexity. There's really a lot of building blocks, and the task in this project was, on the one hand, to identify what are milestones. It could be linked to economic actors, it could be linked to policies, it could be linked to culture, to identify these milestones, but also to think what are sequences between them. So what is maybe really urgent now as we speak, what might take some time, and what can be taken even longer. So to have some sort of idea of possible transition pathways. And so these kind of exercises, they're done on a city level, as here on the regional level. And of course, most famously, perhaps, we know similar sort of discussions linked to global politics as for climate change, where with climate neutrality, we have a global goal for 2050. And a lot of discussion. What would be ways to make this globally agreed on Paris Agreement goal more possible in the current world? And with these examples, you might, of course, ask yourself, so what is the link here between these different projects and the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who was working a long time before all this and had little knowledge or anticipation possibilities of these intricacies of the beginning Anthropocene. And what I would like to suggest now in the second part is that what is very interesting about Kant's writings, sort of at the intersection of writings on history, politics, and morality, you can find a sort of articulation of a philosophical version of strategic foresight and backcasting, which is, of course, not language that Kant is using, but which takes a very similar structure, but is a philosophical version for it. And so that's what I would like to introduce now in the second part. And the starting point here is Kant's Anthropology. The Anthropology was basically a lecture series that was delivered by Kant over many decades, and it therefore also accompanied most of his theoretical writings. So there's probably a very strong connection between the evolution of this lecture series and these other writings. And it was finally published late in his life as a pragmatic anthropology. Why pragmatic anthropology? Because in the introduction, Kant says, and this is an anthropology, which is an investigation of what human beings, as free-acting beings, make of themselves, or can or should make of themselves, in contrast to a physiological knowledge defined as what nature makes of the human being. So the idea is here, we're not talking about something observational, observing behavior. That's interesting too. So Kant calls this physiological knowledge. What we really have here is an early articulation of what's maybe now sometimes often called a reflexive turn. We really want to take a participatory perspective. What can we make of ourselves as free-acting beings? So this is really very crucial to understand this pragmatic perspective when we are talking about foresight now. And the second, I think, really important element of this approach is a distinct radicalism of the Kantian approach to it, is to say this pragmatic knowledge is one that is knowledge of the human being as a citizen of the world. So in other words, the tasks that he sets for himself is to take this perspective of free-acting beings who would like to know what is their place as citizens of the world, or on the planet, you could say today. So what can we develop if we take this kind of perspective for thinking about history and the future? That's the task he sets in this pragmatic anthropology. And in the first book of that pragmatic anthropology, there is one section on foresight, and a beautiful German term, Vorsehungsvermögen, or Praevisio. That was the kind of language of the time, where he introduces in pretty strong language the importance of foresight. He says, to possess this faculty interests us more than any other, because it is the condition of all possible practice and of the ends to which the human beings relate the use of their powers. So very strong language, and the idea is something like, when we talk about practices always include desires, and desires include an element of foresight of what we would like to achieve, and therefore foresight is really a necessary element for talking about practices. And in this very dense section on paragraph on foresight, Kant introduces different ways of thinking about foresight. He does not use these categories. I'm just presenting them here as a way of ordering the discussion. So on the one hand, he says we can think about foresight as a kind of empirical foresight. What he means by that is that we can think of ourselves when we talk about practices as creatures of being, of habit. We repeat things and we expect things to be happening based on this habit. He gives the example of a farmer's calendar where we say, okay, at a certain date, we expect another cold period, and only after that cold period are you allowed to harvest. And this is something that's guiding practices. If it doesn't work, it doesn't really matter. We will still believe it. It's just something that is sort of repeated from the past. So that's the empirical foresight, a kind of repetition from the past. And he distinguishes it from another form of foresight, which he calls delusional foresight, which is something maybe that is also in evidence in some of the current work on future making, when you have so-called future gurus who have some really precise insight on what's going to happen. And Kant calls this delusional foresight because it's based on the idea that somebody or some people have a specific faculty to have insight into the future. But Kant's view, of course, is that it is impossible to have any kind of sensory, empirical view of the future, which is unknown. And therefore, this kind of type of foresight is necessarily delusional. And then we have a third type, rational foresight, where we have this important distinction that we already heard in the introduction, and that I'm here labeling between anticipation and this pragmatic point of view. So the idea of anticipation is that we can think of human beings as subject to all kinds of causal mechanisms that we study. And because we know these causal mechanisms, we can make certain extrapolations of what we know from the past and the present into the future. So if we talk about sustainability, for example, the most famous example for that is probably the Limits to Growth report, which kind of set the agenda for much of the sustainability discussion. And that was a report that was using data on trends of resource extraction and pollution production to say, if trends like this continue, then we're necessarily going to reach a level of peak this, peak that, and a kind of global collapse. So it was a what is called a forecasting method. So we take data from the past, we extrapolate and try on this way to anticipate what is going to happen. And this is, of course, very, very important. But at the same time, it's not the only way to exercise such foresight. We could also say, before we just focus on tendencies, what is the point of looking into the future? What are the kind of ends that we aspire to? And based on that, so this is this backcasting again, we can ask ourselves, okay, what are ways to think about possible pathways of getting into that direction? And so this is the kind of contours now of the foresight as consolation that I would like to briefly sketch. And Kant's version of this foresight as consolation has different elements. I'm just sketching some of them here. The first one, very closely linked to his moral and political philosophy, is the idea if we project toward the ends of human beings as individuals and as a species, we can sketch something like a desirable cosmopolitan future based on the idea of person as ends, having a capacity for autonomy as individuals, and as political collectives, as republics. So there's a kind of notion of a minimalist notion of what could be possible based on this idea. Whatever is going to happen on specific technologies, tastes, and so forth we want to have, it will be really very important to have this capacity of autonomy as individuals and as collectives, and that should be sort of a north star of thinking about possible progress in history. And now the links to the anthropology is to say, for thinking about this progress, we can think of the human being as an animal that is capable of reason. So it has the power of practical reason and it has a consciousness of freedom, of power of choice. It is subject to a law of duty and to the feeling, which is then called the moral feeling, he says, that justice or injustice is done. So we have these possibilities, but we are also the famous crooked timber. We are also exhibiting a desire of what is unlawful, a tendency to evil which stirs. So there is this kind of complex aspect to human beings as practical beings that can go in different directions. And especially if you see this last quote there from Kant, you might, of course, very well wonder how on earth do we think it is possible that this kind of cosmopolitan idea could be anything else than a lofty ideal, if we know these are really the tendencies to evil which stirs, and we know this, of course, from economic conflicts, geopolitical conflicts, and so forth. So how can you reconcile these different thoughts? How would any kind of consolation be possible? And that takes me to the sort of distinct backcasting move of Kant, which has two elements. On the one hand, Kant proposes that if we set ourselves ends, we can try to identify signs of possible progress in history. And so it's really signs, it's possibilities. We're not talking here about something that will happen. It's really a possible progress. And here we come back to this topic of the cracks. We're not just looking for the good things. We're really looking also for the difficult things. And he specifically highlights this idea of an unsocial sociability, with the idea that human beings need to be in society for cultivating their relations, their culture, their science, and so forth. At the same time, this being in society is all the time also somewhat antagonistic. So there is these conflictual elements that we can see in the economies, in politics, is a kind of permanent discourse, which, however, in Kant's view, also allows development of capacities, of technologies. And this is something that is possible, and that's sort of the second element now. If we are able to see this unsocial sociability and the discourse and try to translate it into institutions and ways of responding to that translate this antagonism in ways that contribute to what we might have as ends. And so here comes the second crucial element, public reason as a process of translating latent into manifest functions. This is again a bit of an anachronistic language, of course. So the latent and manifest function comes from sociology, with the idea that there are societal functions that could be latent, that is, something is happening, antagonisms in the economy or in politics, and they are not necessarily something that the actors in these antagonisms are aware of. However, via processes of public reasoning, we could try to have a discussion of these functions and try to make them manifest. Try to think what kind of legislations, policies, and so forth could help us to translate these antagonisms into something that contributes to what we would like to achieve as individuals and as a society. So there's a translation process that's really very crucial to translate these cracks and the discord into something that possibly contributes to progress. And then, of course, the question, if that is the very roughly the contours of Foresight as consolation from this Kantian perspective, what might be insights or things to retain or questions that we could take from this philosophical perception of strategic foresight when thinking about foresight in the present and about planetary boundaries and so forth? And so I have here for you a couple of points that I personally thought were interesting when I was working on this. On the one hand, I think Serafin actually alluded to it in his introduction. We're living in an age of digital transformation, AI, machine learning, and all this means that we are living in a society that is very strongly powered by predictive ways of organizing society and also trying to control and survey society. And so this is very much based on this kind of predictive learning from the past. And Kant's insistence on this distinction between prediction and anticipation on the one hand, and foresight on the other, I think is therefore all the more important if we have discussions about how would we like to respond and maybe adapt society in response to these cracks and conflicts that we see in the present. So it's a very important, I think, distinction that he has anticipated. And it is linked to a second important point, which is the relation between foresight and different temporal scales, if you want to take care of others and the planet. There is a quote, it's also from the section 35, to live for the day without caution and care does not bring much honor to human understanding. The context of this quote is very irritating. He talks about a Caribbean in his hammock who basically idles around and manages to sell his hammock that he needs for sleeping in the night, so without any kind of care or foresight of what he needs in the night. And that is, of course, very irritating because this Caribbean, at the time of when Kant was writing, the Saint-Domingue, what's now known as Haiti, was actually one of the most productive colonies. So they were far from being idling. They were a very important economic powerhouse. And more importantly, there was the first full-scale attempt to collectively abolish slavery, long before discussions in Europe. And so this was happening actually, and I think must have been known to Kant. So this is a bit irritating that he has this, he uses this example. But I think the philosophical point that we can still take from it, from this discussion, is that, and that's a very relevant one for today's discussion, when we talk about future making, that the temporal scale is extremely important, and that especially because in our current culture, economically and politically, we have constantly pressure for some sort of short-termism, so relatively short cycles of thinking where we want to get at. And if we really want to think about ends, very often we need much longer cycles. So remember, this circular economy roadmap was by 2050. And Kant ambitiously, with his philosophical foresight and the cosmopolitan ideal, does not even give a specific time, right? He just sets it as a condition of possibility to really leave it very wide open that this is a long-term thinking, as is very appropriate if you think about his planetary boundaries, 10,000 years, we're talking about geological epochs and really want to have a fundamental discussion of what is possible. So this temporal scale is something really very important not to forget about, and especially not to go too much into short-termism. And it's linked to a third point that he's making when he states, you have often, because of procrastination, made this promise to yourself, but you have always broken it under the pretext of making an exception just this once. So one phenomenon that we can see already with this future making is that we project desirable futures and we write nice scenarios, but it can actually happen under a context where there is maybe already an implicit understanding that we're not going to do it. So think, for example, of the climate neutrality goals, which also are popular in the longer distance, 2050, because you can maybe say, I don't have to do anything right now. I can just delegate it into the future. So there is a kind of a real challenge of, here we could say procrastination, but also of a simulation of foresight, which in my view makes it all the more important to link the idea of what is an end to a very realist discussion of what are the kind of conflicts and antagonisms in the present that we need to think about if anything is supposed to happen. So this is, I think, is another really important point that is emerging from this discussion. And the fourth one, and surely also a controversial one, is that Kant, as an Enlightenment figure, is maybe often associated with this view of progress, or maybe even a manifest destiny, that humanity somehow goes in one direction and we were preordained for some sort of progress. And now we know we have huge cultural diversity, different trends across across regions and the globe. So is this idea of trying to identify a possible future, not necessarily very problematic? Will it not impose some sort of Eurocentric values on other persons? And I think these are really very important questions. At the same time, if you think back of the examples I gave from the highway or from this road mapping exercise for circular economy, what you see here also is there is a sort of political necessity to come to some sort of pragmatic unity. So what is it that we decide to achieve on together? And so there is, on the one hand, an acknowledgement of diversity. On the other hand, there is a need to have some sort of decision on where we would like to go. Otherwise, it's very hard to think about possible pathways into that future. And I think what is the contribution here is to say, can we try to think of desirable futures in a relatively basic, in the sense of important elements, but not too constraining way, as he does with his focus on autonomy and dignity, that might allow quite some space for convergence across different realizations and ideas, while at the same time enabling this sort of pragmatic unity. So it's again this idea of what could we do as free acting human beings. In my personal view, a very good contemporary example of this sort of attempt is the work of Martha Nussbaum, who takes inspiration from Kant when she writes about dignity, and says we can acknowledge cultural differences while at the same time try to remain universalist in a sense of identifying what are essential central capabilities that spell out what we mean by dignity, without thereby imposing specific realizations linked to cultures, satisfying procedures, and so forth. So I think this is a very important contentious point, but an important one in this philosophical version. And it links to a fifth point, crooked timber and human beings, of course. If you think back of this complex map from the Circular Economy Research Network in Quebec, when you do forecasting, you have to get all these an account of all these trends, policies, research on behavior, and so forth. And what's happening here very quickly, I think, is that you sort of lose track of the question, what is a human being, or what are we as free acting beings? And I think the contribution of Kant's philosophical contribution that is really subtle and contains several elements. On the one hand, of course, it says we need to start from crooked timber, so have a goal, but be very realist about what are pathways for going there. And I think this includes also, if you think, for example, back to my initial slide with the planetary boundaries, so sustainability courses be included. There's maybe a tendency to say, okay, here are the planetary boundaries. This is really bad. And now we have some sort of moral exhortation. And I think the idea here of Kant is that we have to acknowledge these constraints and also think about what is a safe or caring space on the planet. But at the same time, that does not mean at all that you can not focus on very realistic ways of developing probable pathways that are maybe not at all communicating in terms of planetary boundaries, but maybe say, okay, if we talk about highways in a city, we need to talk about congestion pricing so that people feel when they drive what are the costs to drive at specific times, or we really need to talk about what makes access to public transport more convenient, so that it's a kind of a default that people can take in public transportation. Or if you think about climate politics, carbon pricing might be a very important element to incite selfish companies to take the costs that they produce on others into their considerations. And of course, that might be even one that is in cosmopolitan spirit, a policy that carbon pricing in a country is important, but also in a way that interacts or takes the interaction with other societies into account. So I think on this level, for example, this carbon adjustment mechanism that the EU just has introduced to say, okay, we have carbon pricing, but we will also increase a mechanism that makes if you import steel or other products, creates a cost for people or makes an incentive to decarbonize production elsewhere to maybe reduce this carbon leakage as we know it. So these kind of policies I think are very central here. And they take me to another point with a crooked timber that at least right now in Canada is causing a lot of discussion, maybe in Munich and Germany too. We had this Davos forum with a speech of Mark Carney on it's a rupture, end of the rule-based international order. And if we think here of this philosophical version of Kant, what is very interesting in it, he has for this his desirable future, he has, as you I'm sure know, he has this idea that we have to think of autonomy in terms of republics. And then, however, he makes a very sharp distinction between alliances and leagues for peace. So an alliance, in his view, is something where states gang up together for advantage and therefore always defer or keep the possibility of imminent conflict. Whereas the efforts to create a League of Peace is one where the focus is really on trying to say what makes republics independent so that they are not forced to engage in war with others. And so the focus becomes here very much one of what in this discussion that I just meant in the speech is now called strategic autonomy. So what are ways of providing transportation, food, self-defense on a territory in order to reduce the need for this kind of war-prone alliances. And I think it's something that is also very interesting in terms of then rethinking a trade, because on the one hand, now there's a tendency to maybe read Kant as one that would say, okay, we need to just have variable geometry with a lot of trade agreements with other types of partners. But we could also approach this topic more from one of this strategic autonomy and think maybe some sort of reduction in trade is not such a bad thing. Maybe tariffs actually will help us to achieve a more a new kind of ordering that prevents the kind of growth phenomena that we have seen before when we talked about these planetary boundaries, which will involve a lot of sacrifice, but we understand why the sacrifice is needed. And so I think there's something very interesting here in these ideas of Kant. The only real blind spot I personally feel is that he has very interesting things to say about individuals and about states. He says almost nothing about, as far as I know, about economic organizations and their role in this, in similar Republican considerations that we could have with respect to organizations. So these were 5 points, and I just want to close, if I may, with one last one. Because with Serafin, we also talked about education when preparing this presentation. So I just want to give you one quick glimpse of how this backcasting with philosophical inspirations can be used in sustainability teaching. So in one class here that's taught every year, we're using one approach of backcasting for sustainability with the idea you can work with municipalities, private organizations, communal organizations, and desirable futures that they project. So think again of this highway example that I gave at the beginning. So trying to work on scenarios that allow you to spell out what are desirable futures 5, 10, 15 years from now. And then try to work back with them. What are different ways in which different stakeholders would have to be involved if we want to make such a desirable future more probable, including the anticipation of risks that this involves. And what's very interesting, in my view, and when we do this, is that it's very, very beneficial to start this not with a desirable futures or with a specific mandate with an organization, but to first have a reading, and we usually use two. One is Martha Nussbaum to talk about what is human dignity, the human being in such actions, and another one is the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who extends this discussion of dignity to one of about the kind of reciprocity relations we can have when we talk not only about human-to-human relations, but also human-to-ecosystem relations. And I think this kind of philosophical consideration about what is a human being as a practical human being is very, very beneficial when we do this kind of future making that is now in vogue. And I think it's also important in all these dystopias that we know from anticipation, giving us some sort of consolation of what is possible collectively. Thank you very much.